From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, we are very lucky to get a chance to talk about a lot of different technologies, a lot of new technologies, and bring on a lot of people that are building some of these things. But today we're going to look at it from a little bit different perspective. So we're definitely going to keep digging into new technologies, but we're going to talk to somebody who has really been following this, tracking it, analyzing it, kind of since the beginning or the beginning of what's this new stack of technologies. And so very excited today to have our old friend, good friend, Alex Williams from the new stack on the show. Alex, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
You know, you and I have had a million conversations. I don't know that we've ever done it on this podcast. You've had me on your podcast, so it's great to have you on the Cloudcast finally.
Oh, so honored to be invited. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah. So, I assume, and I make assumptions sometimes, but I assume our listeners know the new stack. They know you. But for anybody who maybe have been living under a rock for the last 3 or 4 years, tell us what you've been doing with the new stack and kind of how it's evolved over the last, 3.5 years.
Oh, thank you. Well, the new stack started in April of 2014, and it started really after I had spent years reporting for places like Read Write Web and SiliconANGLE and TechCrunch. And at those different places, I wrote about enterprise. And a lot of it was based upon breaking news. At Read Write Web, it was a little bit more in depth, and you could explore issues and try to figure them out for readers and helping them understand what it was what was going on. And it really struck me after being at TechCrunch, really, that there was really this need for not just covering the breaking news, but actually helping people understand what these technologies are all about. And that was right about the time where we were starting to see this real scale start to materialize, not just for companies like Airbnb and Twitter, but for the enterprise companies out there. And there were lots of new companies that were taking very different approaches to building out technology stacks. And one of them in particular was Docker. And Docker really captivated my interest because of what they were doing with container technologies. And so it really became part of our mission at that time to focus on at-scale application development, deployment, and management with a focus on explanation and analysis. And that really just opened up so much for us. It has really given us an opportunity over these past 3 years to look at these technologies, look at open source projects, look at the companies that are adopting these technologies, and trying to help understand what these new technologies are, what these new developments are. And it really has been kind of a never-ending process of just learning and helping people better understand these things. And really, that's what we continue to do. Our goal really is still that. It's on focus on at-scale development, deployment, and management.
Yeah. And, I've been – sometimes you'll be like reading your Twitter feed and day to day, it is what it is. But over a few weeks or months or something, you kind of go, I get the sense of something. And one of the things that I've been sensing a lot lately is, people with all the new projects that have been coming out, especially around the open source space. So,
right.
Things around containers, things around schedulers, application frameworks, big, all these tons of stuff going on. It feels like there's something new every couple weeks. And I get the sense that people are kind of overwhelmed in figuring out like what's up, what's down, what's successful, what's not, and all that stuff. And so I was like, okay, this is a perfect opportunity to get Alex on because you guys focus on trying to make sense of this every day, let alone, and you do it in a way that's, like you said, you're trying to be more thoughtful about it. You're trying to not just crank out headlines. It's, let's understand the people behind it. Let's try and connect the dots for people because things are moving fast. How do you go about doing that? Because at the end of the day, you guys are, I don't know, you're sort of a new type of media organization, but there's a certain amount of immediacy people want, but at the same time, you don't want to be super fast. So, I mean, how do you, like you guys have to keep up with it to begin with? You have to make sense of it. And then you're going to write about it and talk to people about it and make podcasts and videos. Like, how do you balance those two things? Or how are you guys even keeping up with it if the market's struggling with it?
Well, we really have a good editorial team, and it's really led by Job Jackson, our managing editor. And Job is a longtime journalist, and he's immensely helpful in this. We also have people on our team who I think are, born in data research, for example. We have Lawrence Hecht has been helping us. We have a lot of people writing for us who are come from more of an independent analyst background. Johnny Kiram, MSV, and Krishnan Subramanian has been a technical editor on our Kubernetes state of the ecosystem book. So I have to give credit to those people who are really, top notch. And I really think it does go back to our mission again. And we're looking for those stories that focus on at-scale application development, deployment, and management. When we first started, though, we had a hard time really focusing because, you could really become very thin with that kind of a focus because, there's front-end developers and there's back-end developers, right? And so when we're looking for stories, we're mostly focusing on the infrastructure itself, right? And the infrastructure technologies that are just booming right now. And that's helped us, I think, define ourselves to some extent and helped us focus on these people and these companies that are essentially building the platforms for developers in many respects. Yeah. And that to us is a very interesting story. And it really then gives that capability for those front-end developers to build those apps in a more effective manner. I also think that we just look for those really, we have to use our news judgment to look for stories that we think are interesting. And so, you look for stories over the past week on the news stack or the past month, we had a story on, I'm looking just here, like there's a GitHub Adam Text Editor story that did very well. We have stories that just do very well on open source data mining tools. We have stories that are take a more cultural look on the weekends where we look at, issues like we have one on the dark side of Silicon Valley hacker houses. So, where we're trying to focus on, I think just in summary, before I babble too much, we try to focus on that infrastructure story. Yeah. We see then also really the need to tell stories across different mediums. And I think that's something very, very important to us. So we have the stories that you read on the news stack every day, but we also put a big emphasis on podcasting and ebooks. And we're starting now to do more live streaming. And we really believe that that's key to providing people with different kinds of experiences that help them get a fuller perspective on what's actually happening out there in the world.
Yeah, no, I think, two of the things that I've always really appreciated what you guys do, one is like you said, the storytelling aspect. I had a chance to do a roadshow with Gene Kim over the last couple of months, and we were talking about DevOps and culture and a lot of things. And you realize that, there's a reason why the Phoenix project was so successful is that, at the end of the day, it was sort of a novel about IT, but it allowed people to say, oh, okay, I can relate to that person. I can relate to that problem they had. And yeah, I might not remember all the technical details, but I can pass that story along to somebody else. I can give it along as advice. Right. So that I think is really important when we have a big time of change, which we have in our industry right now.
Right.
The other thing I think you guys do really well, and I commend you on, is you're not afraid to go outside of your core team, right? You've had people who co-host your podcast, like Donnie Burkholz, who was an analyst somewhere else at the time, but was willing to jump in. You've had guest authors that write pieces that are really in depth. They just happen to be the people that are also building it. So, and I think you hit on this idea that there isn't one way that people consume information anymore. It may be audio, maybe video, it may be short form, maybe long form, and so figuring out how to do that for lots of people is important. You talked about you were in the enterprise space for a while, and I think everybody who's been in IT has been in that space. We're now in a time where it feels like the rules are all kind of being rewritten. What's a vendor? What's a community? What's a foundation? What's the cloud? Who do I get technology from? Who do I partner with? Do you find you have to kind of unwire your brain for kind of the old rules to what the new rules are evolving to? Or, how are you adapting to these sort of different changing times?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that, that we weigh a lot is, who we're writing for, right? And increasingly those people are software engineers and developers, and that's really our core, that core community out there. They're very young. The people who, it's actually quite interesting. I was looking at our demographics and the number of people who are our readers are, 18 to 24 and 25 to 39 are almost as equal to the group of people from 25 to 39 to 40 and 54, whatever it is. So we see a very strong young community there. But there's also people who have a level of maturity about the market and the ecosystem. And I find that these are the people who you really have to really talk to, right?
Yeah.
And that's I think one thing that we're finding is that we need to be out on the ground more. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to be looking at, because what is happening in the world right now, as you well know, is more and more people have access to these sophisticated technologies than ever before. And they've been abstracted to a degree where they're much easier to use. And people may just be starting with a REST API at this point. They may never have had the chance to, use REST-based APIs. And that may seem old-fashioned to some who are more, who are on the cutting edge and thinking of the modern replacements of the REST-based APIs, such as, gRPC or something like that. But they're still out there and they're reading this stuff. And when they start picking it up, their adoption rate is actually very fast. Then they start, I have a family, an in-law who is in IT, and he's working for a transportation company, and he's kind of fits this mold. But he's now, now they're like, deep into using the Elk stack, right? And that to me says is like when people catch on to these new technologies, they catch on to them very quickly, and then they accelerate rapidly into actually understanding it very, very quickly. It's not like it takes them another 5 years to really start becoming accustomed to this. It'll take them 5 years to really start to understand the overall implications of these technologies. I think that's a different kind of a thing. To me, it's a lot like, playing a sport, right? If you learn to play a sport when you're young, you can hit the ball in the first 6 months or so and play the game, but you don't learn but it takes you a few years to actually learn what the game's all about.
Right.
I think that's true here, but I think what we're seeing is that we're increasingly looking for the people who are new, who are using these technologies, who are starting to adopt them, and I just think that's going to be I think there's just this wonderful greenfield of stories out there that can be told about all these companies who are buying vendor technologies or using open source projects. And it's those people who I think really, will make the difference in how this whole market really evolves. Yeah. So we're really trying to reach them and hear what they're doing so we can help. I think one of the things is we really feel like we consider ourselves kind of a split between a news organization and an analyst group. We're not quite either in many ways. But also in many respects, we feel like we're part of this community.
Yep.
And, we're not out there to necessarily break news, but, we might have stories that actually are new and have kind of a different angle on them that is breaking in its own way, right? But it's much more based upon the people and the technology itself.
Yeah. No, and I think that's important in a couple of ways. You talk about sort of knowing your audience. I think we're going through an interesting time where, if you use this analogy, a few years ago, you would see a certain crowd of people at, say, a VMware event, and you go, okay, that's kind of the infrastructure of the day. And then, you would go to, say, like an OpenStack event, and you would see a lot of the same people, and you'd go, okay, are they sort of transitioning from one domain to another? And then, we're seeing some of those people in places like DockerCon or at KubeCon or something. And I think we forget sometimes that the people that are creating information, whether it's news or podcast or whatever, are going to they're either going to do one of two things. They're going to either present to a certain audience or they're going to come from a certain point of view. And I think sometimes people all think everything's made for them, whether they're 25 or 45 or something like that. And so, sometimes you got to kind of go, okay, who are they targeting this towards? You made an interesting statement. You said, we're kind of news and we're kind of an analyst organization, but maybe we're not either one of them. The other thing that is interesting to me these days is we have an overwhelming amount of data. We all talk about that, but to a certain extent in some of these new technology areas, we don't have the same kind of data that we used to have. So, for example, people will it's hard to, we have a lot of companies that are non-public companies. So, how many customers they have, how much revenue they have, the sort of the metrics we used to use to determine winners and losers or who is in what place isn't as readily available, and we kind of make guesses. People want to use kind of ancillary data like GitHub stars or number of contributions or. How do you guys sort of make sense of kind of the weirdness of data we have right now? And, we see things in surveys, but, how do you guys think about the rightness of data or the usefulness of data?
It's a good question. And one thing we actually work on quite a bit is doing data research of open source communities. And, and we've done our own surveys and we're on the ground a lot talking to people all the time. One of the things that it's a really interesting time, Brian. I mean, one of the really fascinating things that we've been seeing and kind of in the data that we're collecting is this real dynamic between the business and the open source community, right?
Yep.
And it's really quite insightful to look at it from a business perspective, but an open source perspective. And it almost becomes like a story about labor and where the labor is and how the labor is treated. And one of the insights we've learned is, trying to looking at it from like a price performance perspective and being able to look at how are businesses using open source technologies and how are they contributing to those open source technologies? Are they doing it to enhance their own company's technology? Are they using it to help a customer's open source technology? Or are they just doing it for the love of the open source technology itself? And then how do they manage their engineering groups and their developer groups internally to participate in those open source communities? And you start to see some patterns. And one of the patterns you see is that there's this real contrast between the business objective and the people who are involved in the open source communities from the business itself. So what you have is this company that might be thinking about the bottom line and, and the margins they're getting on things. But really the people who are working in those companies who are involved in open source projects may not really care about the bottom line terribly much as one of their counterparts in finance does. What they're doing, the people in the open source communities, they become part of communities, and they really start to see their own identities emerge in these communities, and it becomes quite tribal in a way, right? We've seen this. Right. I think you could look at, for example, the CNCF, and you could start mapping out the different tribes of the different of the CNCF, right? How did how the Linker D group get together, right? Fluent D, right? Who are the people behind the Kubernetes group, right? When you start looking at it from that perspective, you start to see some really interesting patterns, and you start to see some of the real, who you can say may be the winners are and who may be the losers, right? Or the ones who may just have to pivot entirely because their technology that they've been really focusing on may not have the community strength of another project, right?
Right.
And so that's one way we're trying to look at it. And I think it's just as much as everyone else, we're looking for, I think we look for the ones who are really helping others better understand the market, because no one knows everything, right?
Right.
And so when I see companies out there really telling their story effectively, that tells me that they're thinking about their business, they're thinking about the community, and they're putting an effort into that because they know it's going to be a way for them to gain some introspection themselves about who they are and what role they play in the community itself. Right. And so then it becomes just a matter of what recipes do you use to try to figure all that stuff out? And for us, it's been focusing, I think, more so on the people than anything else. We want to see where, what the people, who the people are in these different communities, who they represent, and that then helps us tell a story about the market and what's happening.
Yeah, no, I think that's good insight. I think I still find a lot of people that have some misperceptions about, let's just say, open source and so forth. There's this belief that businesses, kind of consumers of the software, if you will, are making a decision of, well, if we go open source, that means we're going to contribute lots and lots of code, and if we're not going to contribute lots and lots of code, then open source isn't interesting, and that maybe was a way of thinking about things 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I see the dynamics as, I am seeing more and more directors and VPs who realize that, they essentially have to be, the marketing arm for their engineering team, right? They have to be out speaking at events and trying to recruit and find the best talent.
Yeah.
We're finding people who, realize that innovation's happening in these communities and it's just a faster pace. And so it's a different, even if they're working with a vendor that is involved with open source, like, okay, I've got to learn how to work with you on a quarterly basis now as opposed to every year. And so you're right. It's the dynamics of it are very, very different. And, there's definitely opportunity for people to kind of learn it, for people to help explain it and so forth. Let me ask you one sort of last question, and then
Sure.
I want to hit on a couple of the projects you guys have been cranking out lately. Do you guys feel like, started in 2014, things were crazy, the containers are blowing up, and we're now into 2017. We've been through a DevOps phase and Agile and containers and foundations. And do you feel like any of that is what you would call mature today? Or do you feel like, well, maybe if I'm dealing with stuff mature, it's outside the realm of what the new stack should be focused on? Do you guys kind of gauge yourself by how mature something is, or do you go after just kind of what's really interesting to you in the marketplace?
Well, our focus is on scale, right?
Okay.
And the deployment, development, and management of at-scale technologies. And so we're still very, very interested in the container technology landscape, especially as more companies are using container technologies in production. And when companies are using these technologies in production, then they have to think about networking. They have to think about storage. And I think that mirrors what we are seeing as more relevant conversations in the people who we're talking to.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a lot of interest in like how do you treat storage? How do you treat state? Mm-hmm. These are big topics of interest to people right now, and people are trying lots of different things. And so when you look at it from that perspective, right, you start talking to people and they'll say, oh, I've looked at all the overlay network technologies and there's some really good ones out there, but we're still trying to figure that out. Right.
Yeah.
That's, so that I think is like the sign of a maturing ecosystem. When you start seeing actually the hard questions being answered about how actually do you use this in production itself.
Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you see companies like still using older technologies. Like I was talking to one company that actually until just recently have been using a fork of CloudStack that they had developed. And so it's still kind of that real mix of different things. I mean, for example, I think also like if you look at the serverless ecosystem, which we're following very closely, it has, that's still so green, right? But again, it's focusing. It has a big focus on scale and how companies are scaling out their application architectures.
Yep. Yeah. No. I think we all have to be a little bit careful, getting too enamored with, the new technologies are fun. I think there's times when people got to be a little bit, cautious when they make statements like, "Oh, everybody's doing this. Everybody's running nothing but 12-factor." And you go, maybe you need to get out a little more and kind of get a sense of, get outside the what is it? Like Rodrigo Flores always says, get outside the 280 bubble and see what else is collecting dust in somebody's data center. Well,
totally.
Well, very cool.
Totally.
Listen, you guys are cranking out a whole bunch of different things. You're at a lot of different places. What are some of the newest things that people should definitely go check out from the new stack here recently?
Oh, thanks, Brian. We just published the State of the Kubernetes Ecosystem ebook. It is the first book of a 3-part series. In the second book, which will come out later this year, we'll look at patterns and pipelines of the Kubernetes ecosystem. And then in the final book, we'll look at how the Kubernetes ecosystem is intersecting with other communities such as data streaming, for example, and the Docker community. So that's a big project for us. This is a conference season, so we're out on the road all the time. And we're really doing a lot more live streaming. So you should, if you see us at a conference, please come over and say hello. We always love to meet new people.
Very cool. We will get all those things in the show notes. We'll have links to the ebooks and all the different podcasts that you guys run. And folks, if you don't know Alex, he's very easy to find. He's always the guy wearing the fedora. He's usually in front of a microphone somewhere right in the middle of one of these events. So, Alex, listen, man, we could talk about things for a long time, but thank you so much for the time today. And Aaron couldn't make it, but he sends his best, and we'll try and be on the next show. So we need to get you back on again soon. Hopefully, we can make this kind of a regular thing. Get your perspective on things. So thanks for being on, folks. As always, thanks for listening. Tell a friend, rate the show on iTunes, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.